Imagine this. In May, the United States slammed the brakes on a single piece of technology and overnight changed the rules of a multi-billion-dollar game. Washington announced it would stop exporting the LEAP-1C engine core technology to Comac, the Chinese company building the C-919 passenger jet, saying the tech could be used for military purposes if it fell into the wrong hands. On paper, that move looks simple. Cut the critical part, and you slow or stop the plane. It's like pulling a key cog out of a machine. The goal was straightforward: create leverage, slow China's progress, and protect U.S. interests. But things rarely behave like the plans on a politician's desk. Instead of grinding to a halt, China reacted the way a cornered team often does. It doubled down. Domestic engineers accelerated a homegrown engine program so the C-919 could keep flying. At the same time, a surprising ripple started to travel through the industry. Airbus quietly became a clearer alternative for big Chinese orders, and Boeing, once the default choice, found itself suddenly vulnerable. That single export decision didn't just affect parts and factories. It sent shockwaves through geopolitics, supply chains, and the balance of power in the global aviation market. Over the next few minutes, we'll unpack how one policy intended to slow arrival may have pushed an entire industry to rearrange itself, and why that matters not just to airlines, but to global strategy and trade. To understand why this move was so explosive, we need to step back and look at the aviation market itself. For decades, the skies have really been a two-player game: Boeing in the United States and Airbus in Europe. These two giants control more than 90% of the global passenger jet market. Airlines around the world have to pick one or the other, and the rivalry is fierce. Think Coca-Cola versus Pepsi, but with airplanes worth $100 million each. China, however, has been trying to change that. With its massive domestic travel market, the largest in the world by passenger volume, Beijing doesn't just want to buy planes, it wants to build them. Enter the C-919, a single-aisle jet designed to compete directly with Boeing's 737 and Airbus's A320. If successful, the C-919 wouldn't just be another plane, it would be a direct challenge to the West's dominance of commercial aviation. But here's the catch. Building a modern jetliner isn't like making cars or smartphones. Each one is an incredibly complex puzzle of parts, with engines being the crown jewel. The LEAP-1C engine, designed by the US-French joint venture CFM International, was supposed to power the C-919. Without it, the whole program risked falling flat. That's why Washington's decision hit so hard. It was targeting China's aviation ambitions right at the engine room, the most sensitive point. But in doing so, it also raised a critical question. If China can't rely on the United States for engines, where else will it turn? China's answer came quickly: self-reliance. Within weeks of Washington's ban, Chinese state media began spotlighting a project that had been in the works for years. The CJ-1000A, a domestically developed jet engine designed to eventually replace the LEAP-1C on the C-919. On paper, the CJ-1000A isn't yet at the same performance level as the Western alternative. But the symbolism mattered more than the specs. China wasn't going to let the United States hold the keys to its aviation future. Think of it like this. If your neighbor suddenly locks you out of their garage where you've been borrowing tools, you have two choices: give up the project or start buying and making your own tools. China chose the second, even if it meant the job would take longer and be more expensive. And here's the twist. China's government has the money, the engineers, and the long-term patience to play this game. Unlike private companies that have to worry about quarterly profits, Beijing is willing to pour billions into a project for decades if it means independence from Western pressure. This also fits into a much bigger strategy. In recent years, China has pushed the idea of dual circulation, relying less on foreign imports for critical technology and building stronger self-sufficiency at home. The LEAP-1C ban wasn't just a setback, it was fuel on that fire. But while China scrambled to secure its aviation independence, something else was happening in the global marketplace. Airbus began quietly taking Boeing's place in China's skies. Here's where the story takes a sharp turn. While Boeing was caught in the crossfire of US-China tensions, Airbus saw an opening. In April, just weeks after Washington blocked engine exports, Airbus CEO Guillaume Faury was in Beijing shaking hands with Xi Jinping. The result? Airbus announced it would double its production capacity in China, expanding its Tianjin assembly line to churn out even more A320 family jets. For airlines, this was an easy decision. They still needed planes to meet China's exploding travel demand. But buying Boeing was politically risky. Airbus, on the other hand, was European, not American, and therefore a safer bet. Within months, Chinese airlines placed huge new orders with Airbus, including a deal for 160 jets worth over $17 billion. To put that into perspective, Boeing, which once sold hundreds of planes a year to Chinese carriers, delivered just 22 aircraft to China in all of 2022. It was a collapse, not just in sales, but in trust. Imagine two restaurants competing on the same street. For years, customers went to both, splitting business evenly. Then one restaurant suddenly gets into a bitter fight with the landlord, and customers worry it might shut down any day. Naturally, everyone starts eating at the other place. That's exactly what happened with Airbus and Boeing in China. And here's the irony. The US wanted to weaken China's aviation ambitions, but in the short term, the ban handed Airbus the keys to the world's fastest-growing aviation market, while Boeing was left out in the cold. This shift isn't just about who sells more planes, it reshapes the global balance of aviation power. For decades, Boeing and Airbus relied on China as their biggest growth engine. Chinese airlines were expected to buy 8,000 new planes by 2040, worth nearly $1.5 trillion. Losing access to even a slice of that market is like losing oxygen in a marathon. You can still run, but not for long. Boeing's troubles in China also spill over into its global reputation. If Chinese airlines, some of the largest in the world, are leaning toward Airbus, other countries notice. Aviation is an industry built on trust, and perception matters almost as much as performance. A shift in China can cascade into deals in Southeast Asia, Africa, and even parts of Europe. Meanwhile, Airbus gains more than just sales. By building more jets inside China, it deepens its relationship with Beijing. That means political goodwill, smoother negotiations, and maybe even a front-row seat when China decides to push the C919 onto the world stage. In other words, Airbus isn't just making money, it's making friends. And in the long run, that's where the real competition lies. Because while Airbus thrives and Boeing struggles, China's C919 is learning to walk. Every flight test, every delivery, every improvement to the CJ1000A engine brings it one step closer to being a true global competitor. So the question becomes, is the US decision accelerating the very outcome it wanted to prevent? The rise of China's independent aviation industry? Exactly here lies the paradox. Washington's export ban was meant to slow down China's aviation rise, but in practice it may be doing the opposite. By forcing Beijing to go all in on self-reliance and by pushing Chinese airlines into Airbus's arms, the US might have set up a long-term shift in the industry. Think of it like trying to block water with your hands. At first, it looks like you're stopping the flow, but the pressure builds, and eventually the water finds a new path, sometimes carving out an even deeper channel than before. Already, the C919 has entered service on domestic routes, flying passengers between major Chinese cities. It's still limited compared to the 737 or A320, but every flight adds confidence, data, and momentum. Meanwhile, engineers working on the CJ1000A are learning at high speed, because necessity is the greatest teacher. For Boeing, this is more than just lost sales. It's a potential loss of relevance in the world's most important aviation market. And for the US, it raises a bigger strategic dilemma. How do you contain a rival without accidentally helping its competitors and strengthening its resolve? What started as a narrow fight over one jet engine has turned into a story about the future of global aviation. Who makes the planes? Who controls the supply chains? And who writes the rules of the sky? And that brings us to the bigger picture. Aviation is no longer just about planes, it's about power. Every major jetliner is more than a machine, it's a flying symbol of the country that built it. When a nation buys Boeing, it's not just buying an airplane. It's buying into US supply chains, maintenance contracts, pilot training programs, and decades of reliance. The same is true for Airbus, and eventually the same will be true for China's COMAC. That's why the C919 matters so much. If it succeeds, China won't just save billions on imports, it will export influence. Countries in Africa, Southeast Asia, or Latin America that can't always afford Boeings or Airbuses might find a cheaper Chinese alternative appealing. And once those countries adopt the C919, they become tied to Chinese parts, Chinese training, and Chinese financing. It's the aviation version of what Beijing has already done with 5G networks and infrastructure projects. So the engine ban, while powerful in the short term, risks accelerating this long-term realignment. Airbus gets more market share, Boeing loses ground, and China learns faster under pressure. In the end, the US might discover it hasn't stopped China's rise in the skies, only changed the flight path. And that sets up the final question. What happens next in this high-stakes game, where every jet is both a product and a pawn in global strategy? What happens next depends on three moving pieces: Boeing Airbus and China's COMAC. For Boeing, the challenge is survival in its most important foreign market. Unless US-China relations thaw, Boeing risks being permanently sidelined in the world's largest aviation hub. That's not just a lost market. It's a blow to Boeing's prestige, profits, and ability to compete globally. For Airbus, the opportunity is historic. By deepening ties with China now, it could lock in decades of loyalty and sales. But Airbus also walks a fine line lean too close to Beijing, and it risks backlash from Washington and Brussels, which are also wary of China's growing power. And for China, the C919 is only the beginning. With state support, long-term funding, and a massive home market to test and refine its planes, COMAC has the runway to eventually challenge the Western duopoly. The key milestone will be whether the CJ1000A engine proves reliable enough to replace Western engines. If it does, China won't just be flying on its own. It will be selling that independence to others. So the US ban on one engine wasn't the end of the story. It was the opening shot in a much bigger battle over who will dominate the skies in the 21st century. Will it still be the familiar Boeing-Airbus rivalry? Or will we look back and say this was the moment China entered the cockpit? That's the question airlines, governments, and passengers will be watching every time a new jet takes off.